just come in for the day, we want to ensure that you have a couple of housekeeping notes. All presentations will be recorded. Please mute your line if you are just listening. Ask questions. We will be monitoring the chat and use your raise hand feature for any of those questions. You can also, I'm not sure, Tom, did you want to have questions wait till the end if possible?
Yeah, definitely. So hold the questions till the end. Another thing to do is put it in the chat if you have a question, and then we'll address that at the end, but at least it captures your thoughts while you're thinking it.
Awesome. And then we will have, we do have the live human captioning available. Our live caption button is in their menu of your Zoom screen, and ASL interpreters are available. So now I want to introduce Tom Siechert. He will be discussing equally effective alternative access planning. And Tom, we'll stop sharing and you are now on.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. And let's see. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Happy that you've joined us for this presentation. This is a presentation actually more than a decade in the making, so I'm really happy to share this information with you. The first thing I wanted to share is some of my experience in higher education and accessible technology. I spent 17 years at Fresno State, starting out as the IT procurement buyer, then a manager, and then for 14 of those years, I focused on building out the accessible procurement program there. I then spent a couple years at Stanislaus State, focusing on the academic technology side of the house, working on instructional materials and technologies, making sure that those were accessible. And then I also spent 7 years as a subject matter expert for what was known as the CSU Accessible Technology Network. And basically, we were a group of subject matter experts that were a shared services group that provided guidance to the chancellor's office. And one of the things that we came up with was the equally effective access planning template and framework that's actually used by universities throughout the country, actually a lot of them without attribution, but if you see those, that's where it came from. That really originated with the CSU and the work that me and my colleagues were doing there. And then actually I'm one of the new folks here in the Accessibility Center. I started as the Procurement Accessibility Specialist last September. And at the top, I wanted to just give this important disclaimer. This presentation is not intended to provide legal advice. Please contact an attorney if that's what you need. And as we discussed a second ago, the Q&A time will be at the end. And feel free to put questions in the chat during the presentation so we can cover them. So here are the topics that I plan to cover today, starting with what even is an EAP, why are EAPs required, talk about the accessibility and access continuum, talk about creating an EAP, talk about the importance of having a communication plan, and then at the end, we'll go over 3 quote-unquote EAPs and do a critical review, which will hopefully help you both in the process of creating EAPs and or reviewing EAPs that you may get from another colleague or another university. So starting off, what even is an EAP? Perhaps you never have heard of it. Perhaps you've maybe heard the phrase, but didn't know what it is or what its definition is. The word EAP is an acronym that stands for Equally Effective Alternate Access Plan. And an EAP has a very specific definition, which is a proactive plan that describes how users with disabilities who are otherwise unable to use information and communication technologies due to accessibility barriers are able to obtain the same benefits, the same information, same services, same learning outcomes by using a predetermined alternate access method that's what's known as equally effective and that has a substantially equivalent ease of use. So keep that in mind, the definition in mind as we go throughout the presentation. Next, I want to talk about, well, why are EAPs required? Where did they even come from? Where do these requirements come from? So the answer is Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. And Section 508 requires that the community college that the information and communication technologies that we develop, that we use, that we adopt, that we procure, meet these requirements. So on this slide, I have an icon of a unicorn. So one of the things that we can do to meet Section 508 requirements is buy that 100% accessible product, which is what I'm calling a unicorn. These may exist. I'm not saying unicorns don't exist, but what I've seen a lot of is vendors that kind of trot around these what look to be unicorns, which are basically VPATs that say that they're 100% support all the accessibility requirements. But when you look beneath the covers there, what you find is it's really a person wearing a unicorn suit. That's not really a real unicorn, not really 100% accessible product. So the other thing, the alternative is we're required to buy the most accessible product that meets our business requirements. This is what's known as the best meets standard in Section 508. And as a part of that, there's certain requirements for the best meets requirements. Starting with documentation, we are required to document our business requirements. We're also required to document our market research, including what alternatives we evaluated and looked at. And then lastly, we need to document what steps we took to evaluate the accessibility conformance levels for each of the products that we looked at. So the other thing that we have to do, right? So Section 508 allows us to buy partially accessible technologies, right? Provided we meet the documentation requirements. But the other requirement is, and this is where EEAPs come into play, is that we're required to provide persons with disabilities an equally effective alternate means of access for the partially accessible technologies that we adopt, use, or procure. So I wanted to just give a quick overview of, it gets a little fuzzy sometimes, the differences between EEAPs, and which come from Section 508, and the individualized accommodations, which is Section 504 that we were just talking about in the previous session. So when you look at EEAPs, they're proactive. They require the identification of real-world accessibility barriers, and they describe an alternate means of access for disability groups that may be affected by the barriers. EEAPs enable access for groups of users. So this is really important distinction between accommodations. Also, by having an EEAP, this should enable users to gain access without having to ask for help, which is the fundamental difference between 504 and accommodations. When you look at accommodations, as most of you probably know, right, this is kind of the world you live in every day, is individualized accommodations, they're reactive, and they require an interactive process to determine what a reasonable accommodation or accommodations are, and they are custom tailored to meet an individual's access needs. This enables access for individuals to make sure that an individual can access the technologies. And as you all know, the users are required to ask for help in order to request an accommodation, provide documentation, and things like that. So on this slide, I want to kind of show what I'm calling the accessibility and access continuum. And it ranges anywhere from what I call, again, the unicorn, and that is technologies that are 100% accessible to all users. To reiterate, I haven't really found any technologies that are like this in 14 years in accessible technology. I'm not saying it doesn't exist or they won't exist, but if it did, that's great. That provides access to everyone. And on the right side of this slide, this allows everyone to obtain the same benefits, the same information, access the same services, have the same learning outcomes, right? Now in the middle, this is where the EEAPs come into play. This is kind of the bridge where it's the proactive planning to provide an alternate means of access to allow specific groups of people with disabilities access to inaccessible technologies, and again, to obtain those same benefits and outcomes. And then lastly, there's the accommodation path, which no matter how wonderful an alternate means of access plan you come up with, there's always going to be the situation where that won't work for a certain individual and their particular needs or access needs or limitations. So accommodation is that last thing that allows individuals to have those adjustments and accommodations to provide access when the alternate access methods won't work for them. Next, we're going to talk about actually creating an EEAP. And it's important to note the prerequisites, what you need ahead of time before you can even start this process. First, you have to have an identification of real-world accessibility barriers. The other thing that's really important is you need a description of the product and its features, what its purpose is, the types and number of users, end users, and how the product is expected to be used. The context here is really critical. The other thing is when you're looking at the barriers for to a technology, you really need to look at what are the functional accessibility implications. So at the end of the day, you may have a number of barriers that you've come up with. You know, what are the key tasks or functions that users with disabilities are not likely able to be completed, right? When you look at a VPAT, if you're familiar with that, there's a section for functional performance criteria. That's kind of the same thing. It takes the specific WCAG criteria of pass-fail, and then it distills it down into, well, how do all of those things impact access for different disability groups? Because that's really what's important, especially when you're trying to create an EEAP, to anticipate this is an alternate way of access for this group that's affected. The other thing about creating an EEAP is creating a well-crafted EEAP requires a lot of creative thinking, involvement of subject matter experts, especially when you're talking about technologies used in instruction and academics. It really often would be the faculty member or chair or the dean of extended education that would know for this technology, this is the learning outcome that this is intended to address, and would know that this alternate means of access, does it meet that same learning outcome or objective or not? The other big aspect is this requires collaboration. It's really not something that can be done well in isolation, right? It really requires collaboration of disability services, often HR, the professionals in disability services, faculty, et cetera, to come up with a well-crafted EEAP. So this slide here is the one that I want all of you to remember. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Is what you're looking at or trying to create, is it even really an EEAP? It's really cut and dry, because if it does not include, if your EEAP or the EEAP that you're looking at does not include an alternate means of access in the plan, it's really not an EEAP. It's something else. It's not an EEAP. And if it does include an alternate means of access, then that is something that's fundamental to having an EEAP. It must include that information to be considered an EEAP. The next thing that's really important to consider when you're creating equally effective alternate access plans is to consider, you've come up with an alternate means of access. Now you need to address, well, is that alternate access plan, is that considered, and this is, a definition of, is it equally effective, right? Will the courts consider it equally effective? Will OCR consider it equally effective if there was a complaint or an action taken? So there's 4 dimensions here, and this is literally what the courts or the agencies would look at when they look at, okay, you had an alternate access plan, but that's not good enough. Was it equally effective for the end users that were impacted? So the first is availability. So does the alternate means of access provide the same availability? So in the case of, say, a software package that's available online, is it available 24/7, 365, right? Next to mention is equivalent benefits. Does your alternate means of access allow users to obtain the same information, receive the same benefits, engage in similar interactions, right? The next aspect is equitable impact. So these are things such as, well, does your plan require users that have disabilities to do extra things that are not required of users that don't have disabilities? One quick example is, do they need to go to a specific location where they would go, and then that's how they would obtain access? And then lastly, this is really critical too, is independence. Does the alternate access, means of access that you've included in your plan, does that allow these users with disabilities a way to be independent, or do they need to ask someone else, perhaps someone without a disability, to help them receive access? So I'll give a real world example here of an athletic ticketing software that allows students to, say, buy tickets to athletic events. It's available online. It's available 24/7, 365. It's a web solution. It's available from anywhere, right? So a university that I'm aware of, they came up with their EEAP for this solution. And what they came up with is, well, it's really easy that any users with disabilities can simply come to the ticketing office on campus that's open between certain hours of the day on certain days. Hopefully, how I described it kind of gives you a hint about, well, was that equally effective, the plan that they came up with? So looking at the dimensions, it fails on the availability, right? So the online software program that's available to everyone else anytime they want was only available to persons with disabilities on certain times, certain days. Does it have an equitable impact? Well, no, because it required users to actually go to a physical location, which is something that people without disabilities did not have to do. Is it independent? Does it provide independence? Well, no. The users need to go to a location and ask someone to help them complete the transaction. And then equivalent benefits. Did that provide equivalent benefits? Maybe, maybe not. So if it's, say, a highly anticipated football game and there's certain seats that are the best that you would want, those might sell out right away. And the person with a disability might not be able to make it to the ticket office for a couple days, and then they get seats that are not as good, or something such as that. So we've talked about what an EEAP is. It's also really important to say what an EEAP isn't, right? So a lot of this presentation is based upon things that I've seen in reviewing hundreds of EEAPs. An EEAP is not a statement to contact your HR or disability services office. It's not a statement to contact the vendor for help. It's not an accommodation plan. It's not an accessibility statement. It's not a link to a vendor's VPAT or ACR. And it's definitely not a link to a vendor's quote unquote commitment to accessibility. So this slide, on this slide, I have a picture of a fallen tree in a forest, which is kind of a philosophical question. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Correspondingly, is an EEAP really an EEAP if no one even knows it exists, right? So I'll give a real world example from one of my previous places of work to illustrate, the importance of communication. So at a university I worked at, I was working in the procurement office, working on accessibility, and we received notice that we needed to implement a Title IX training stat. Like within the next 2 weeks, they wanted to roll this thing out. Additional information is all students were required to use it. If students did not complete it in a timely manner, a hold was placed on their registration, so it's high stakes. And the subject matter is really critical too, because the topic of the training, it's Title IX, but more specifically, this is related to sexual harassment and violence, right? Which is a challenging topic because it's something that fundamentally cannot be addressed through in-person accommodations because of the privacy implications, because of the subject matter, because it's triggering, because there's questions that are asked of the participants that's not appropriate to share with another individual. So the good thing is I immediately contacted my colleague in disability services and said, hey, man, we really need to get on top of this. We need to find a solution. We need to find out for sure, is this thing accessible? And we got access to a sandbox. We found out pretty quickly that this Title IX training wouldn't work for multiple disability groups, including for vision impaired, blind, including mobility impairments, keyboard only users. So the good news is we came up with this great alternate means of access, in this case, alternate media, that was fully accessible, that allowed for, it preserved the privacy of the users, it provided complete independence, and it was fully accessible for everyone that was impacted by the accessibility barriers. So, well, that was the good. Now here's the bad. There was communication gaps, which led to our wonderful alternate means of access not being used. So specifically, we didn't have a formal process or a centralized repository, number one, for EEAPs, and number two, a formalized process to notify certain important people, such as the head of HR, such as the director of disability services. So what happened was, as soon as students inevitably ran into those barriers, the report of that inaccessibility went to the director of disability services, and she immediately went to the 504 coordinator for the campus. And because neither of them knew there was this wonderful alternate access plan or means of access, they came up on an ad hoc basis, what I would describe as a very problematic solution, which was, believe it or not, in-person accommodation where an individual from disability services would read the content and ask questions of the students that couldn't access the solution. So communication is really critical. So, which leads me to the next topic, which is your communication plan. So it's really great to come up with your equally effective access plan, but how you communicate that out is really critical. So I'll focus on first the users with disabilities, then how to have a communication for plan for faculty, staff, and administrators. So this kind of speaks to the whole point. Well, if users with disabilities don't know it exists, does it really exist, right? So first and foremost, users with disabilities need an intuitive, easy to find instructions that describe how they're going to receive access or request access to the alternative access method that's described in the EEAP. The other way that all users with disabilities might benefit is that you need an accessibility statement in a prominent place where people will intuitively find it that lists the known accessibility barriers. It lists any workarounds, if any. It provides their help or support options, and it provides a mechanism on how to report both accessibility issues and any issues an individual might have in using the alternate means of access. The other side of it, and this is where things went wrong at my previous institution, is for faculty and staff, you need a great way so that anyone who would potentially interact with users has easy access, knows where the information is, and this includes people such as your faculty, such as disability services, human resources, IT staff, so that when they have that user that reports, I've got this access issue, that person knows where to go look, and they can immediately, oh, there's this plan, here's the barriers, and they can provide the services faster, and there's a much higher chance that the alternate means of access may be able to be used. The other thing I'll note is IT staff may need to be involved because there's some solutions that require, things to be toggled on, like an accessibility mode or things that make software more accessible. So IT staff is part of that group that needs to have access and have knowledge of this. Then also for administrators, it's important that they're also able to access these things, in part to have a better understanding of the compliance levels of the technologies that the college or district is using, and then also to better judge the risk for the institution's use of inaccessible ICT. So the last part that I wanted to go through is I'm going to do a critical review of 3 EEAPs from different colleges that I reviewed, and hopefully this will kind of bring it all together for you. And I've rated each of the 3 EEAPs on a scale of 0 to 3 stars, and that rating is based upon an evaluation of, does it include the required elements, and an evaluation of the equally effective dimensions that I talked about earlier. So EEAP number 1, a virtual graduation ceremony software. It's web-based. It allows students to provide their picture, provide how to pronounce their name, perhaps their interests, some other things like that. So within the EEAP that I reviewed, here's what information was provided. So it did a good job of describing what the product is and what it does. It listed the parties responsible for deploying and managing the solution. It described what it anticipated were the user groups that would be affected or use it. And then the last thing here, which was a little bit of a shock to me, was it said accessibility barriers, no known issues. Okay. So first thing we're going to consider is, well, does that EEAP include the required elements? So the first, and this is the kicker, this is the slide that I said, if you remember nothing else, it's what makes an EEAP or not an EEAP. So did it describe an alternate means of access? Nope. Okay. Did it identify specific accessibility barriers or any? No. Did it map barriers to affected groups? Well, no, because it didn't list any. So EEAP number 1, well, is that equally effective? Well, that simply can't be evaluated because this quote unquote EEAP did not define any means of alternate access. So it may call itself an EEAP, but it isn't an EEAP. And it's really not helpful to anyone, actually, because there's no information there that would be meaningful, even for accommodation. So EEAP number 2, learning management system. So it described the product. It's a web-based learning management system. And here's the information that was included within the EEAP. It described what the product is and what its purpose was. It listed the vendor's sales contact information. It estimated the quantity and types of users. And then it described in an area called, means of alternate access, it listed the following 2 statements. Support options are available via telephone and email if the user experiences accessibility barriers, and individualized support is also available via one-on-one consultation. Well, it may call itself a means of alternate access, but both of those things are not that. Those are really just support, talking about the support and providing an individual accommodation or help for an individual if they ran into barriers. So that fails the very definition of what alternate access means. And then, to its credit, it did list quite a number of specific accessibility barriers, and it also mapped those to the affected disability group, which was good. So same evaluation. Does EEAP number 2 include the required elements? And the first element is, well, does it describe an alternate means of access? Well, it said it did. It had a heading for that, but the information that was contained in that area was not an alternate means of access. It was really, how would you accommodate someone upon request if there was an accessibility barrier? So that fails to meet that requirement. Next, did it identify specific accessibility barriers? Yes, absolutely, which is good. Did it map the barriers to the affected disability groups? Yes, absolutely. Next, we'll look at, well, is the EAP equally effective? And unfortunately, once again, you can't even evaluate those dimensions because this, again, quote unquote EAP, what was called an EAP, didn't define any means of alternate access. So is it equally effective? No. And is it really an EAP? No. So based upon those things, I gave a rating of 1 star for that EAP. For required elements, it did have some of them. It had 2 of the 3, but more importantly, it missed the core element that you need to even be considered an EAP for did it define an alternate means of access. Then the equally effectiveness is, well, we can't evaluate it because it, by definition, is not an EAP. So EAP number 3. So the last one we'll look at is an internet protocol-based TV streaming service that was made available for students via the web, via their iPhone or Android device, or a Roku box. So the information provided here was the following. It gave a good description of what the product is and what it did. It listed the people responsible for deploying and managing the solution. It estimated the numbers and types of users, which in this case was all students. And it described the environment for its use, which were the dorms. So it did have a section for describing the alternate means of alternate access. And that was any students in these groups that were affected would be able to use existing cable TV for access in specific rooms that would retain the cable service that the university was looking to replace. They also, in the EAP, identified specific accessibility barriers and mapped them to each affected user group. And then lastly, they included an accessibility statement, which was posted prominently on the landing page for this new solution, this IPTV solution for students. And even better, they identified the specific means for users with disabilities to request alternate access. It listed a name, an email, and a phone number for how they would request access, which once they were granted access would be provided entirely independently. So let's rate this one. So EAP number 3, did it include the required elements? So did it describe alternate means of access? Absolutely. Did it identify specific accessibility barriers? Yep. And did it map those barriers to the affected user groups? Absolutely. So yes for all 3. So next, EAP number 3, well, is it equally effective? So did the alternate access that they provided in their plan offer the same availability? So my answer is yes. The next one is did the alternate access provide equivalent benefits? That's also yes. And then did it have equitable treatment for all users? Absolutely. If anything, the users of the cable TV solution had more channels, including local channels, things that weren't necessarily provided by the streaming solution. Then lastly, did the alternate access require affected users to rely on help from others? So it did not, right? So yes, they would need to request the initial access from someone, but accessing the solution itself did not require someone else to help them gain access, if that makes sense. The other caveat that I'll add here is the IPTV solution had a geofence that restricted where it could be used, right? So only you had to be within a certain proximity of the dorms or in the dorms to access it. So this would be different if it did not have that restriction. If this IPTV solution could be used anywhere, from anywhere, with no restrictions, then that plan would have failed on a couple of these dimensions for, did it provide equivalent benefits? No. It doesn't have the same availability. Not really, right? You have to be in a certain place at a certain time, and that's not equivalent, right? You have to be at a certain place. So hopefully walking through those 3 examples kind of give you an idea of how to, if you're given an EEAP or you're creating one, how do you evaluate it? Does it have the required components? And then really importantly, then is it equally effective for your users? And then the rating, as you might suspect, for the 3rd EEAP is 3 stars. It had all the required elements. It met all 4 dimensions of being equally effective. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Yes, Laura?
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, perfectly. Thank you.
Wonderful. Excellent presentation. I really loved the last one where I could see an example of a good EEAP. Is there somewhere where we can look for more examples of EEAPs that meet these standards to sort of get ideas? You mentioned it's a creative process. I would like to expand my creativity if possible.
That's a really great question, and that's something that we and I are actively looking to build that, because I'm definitely one of those people that I learn and get inspired by seeing good exemplars of, okay, this is something that was done really well, and then kind of model, what you're trying to do on something like that. Having that good example, I think, is really critical, and that's definitely something that we will look to try to build and provide. Were there any other questions?
It looks like there is a question from, from Sylvia. In the example about Title 9 training, why didn't the entire college use the alternate product for the entire college?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Why didn't, or I'm sorry?
Why didn't the entire college use the alternate product for the entire product?
Okay, so you said that the accommodation tool was fully, accessible by everyone and it had everything in there. So why were 2 tools still used? Why didn't the college just use all the same one?
Right. So in part, what I would say is that the solution itself is probably it's the same content, but perhaps it's kind of a different presentation of the same information, if that makes sense. So it was a little less clunky for interactivity and things like that, and like taking the quizzes and things like that. We worked around it through the materials, but it was just clunky, if that makes sense. You accomplish the same thing, but it wasn't as just straightforward as watching a video without captions, advancing slides that you couldn't do, taking the interactive knowledge checks, as it went along. That had that been fully accessible, that's probably a better presentation or user experience. Although the same content, was provided in the alternate media materials that were produced, if that makes sense. The other thing is, in addition to that, is the only reason we could produce those alternate media is because we bought the underlying solution. We were paying for that, right? It's a paid third-party solution. So that's the only way they would have ever permitted us to provide their content in another way and provide it actually to a restricted. The people that could access it, it was behind a login, right? So that their intellectual property wasn't just stolen, if that makes sense, right? They had to prove they were a student by logging in through the system to gain access.
Okay, thank you. And maybe it made them think twice about designing the product in the first place. They could just, if they designed the original product to do all of that, then they wouldn't have to provide the second one.
Right, and anecdotally, I believe the vendor did take some of our feedback. I don't know that they ever addressed all of our feedback of all of the things we ran into, but I do believe they made their product a little more accessible in its next iteration.
Okay, thank you.
Then another
Yeah.
question from Pauline. Pauline, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Or Dr. Nance, and then also I have a hand up with from Tim. So Dr. Nance asks, how long have EEAAPs been in use?
That's a good question. And my colleagues might have a more definitive answer. I think we probably started developing the first iteration in the CSU probably about 2011, 2012. We made my colleagues and I made a major revision to the original EAP template and guidance a few years ago. And the original EAP, you didn't ask this, but the original EAP that we came up with kind of missed the main point. Was there was no area to describe what the alternate means of access were, which we addressed prominently in the CSU version of it, which is version 2 of their template, where it's prominently asked, okay, what's your equally effective access plan, you know, for each affected user group, and what are the barriers that it addresses? Hope that answers that question. Then Tim.
Hi. I know that CSU had worked at one point on providing 508 reviews of content across the system. Are we looking at trying to resurrect that or implement that for the CCs? And if the product is not 508 accessible or is not accessible, then are we looking at trying to create a database of EAPs so that everybody's not trying to recreate the wheel each time?
Really great question. I don't know, is Dawn still on the call? I think she may be on a different call right now, but so in the Accessibility Center, we are working with a number of folks in the system to try to address things from a more systemic level, such as, you know, your college buys, your stack, etc. You know, things that are purchased, you know, at a system level, or that colleges can take advantage of, the, you know, either aggregate buys or contracts that are made available to the colleges. That's a work in progress. That's something we would like to do more collaboration with, but that's also something that requires funding to make that happen. The idea of, and like you mentioned, the CSU, I think they're on their 3rd iteration of what they call a VPAT database, or they might have renamed it now, or accessibility sharing space, I think is its current name. And I don't know that we're going to go down that path in the CSU. There is actually a clearinghouse that the GSA at the federal level is working on, which we're watching closely to kind of see what their approach is for that, to see if that's of any value or benefit, or if we could leverage that. The challenge on EAPs, as far as having an EAP repository or something like that, is it really kind of, it can be, or often is, dependent on resources at a local college as far as the details of the EAP, if that makes sense. So the particulars of an EAP, and or even how something is used, right? You may have something like my IT lab or other solutions where there's different aspects of the solution and different colleges implement it differently, right? So they might use certain functions and others don't, but it's something we're keeping our eye on and seeing what could be developed to kind of leverage things so that everyone doesn't have to recreate the wheel.
Okay. I'm gonna reach out and contact you offline
Sure.
about something specifically that we need, that I'd like to take a look at with you.
That sounds great.
Okay, there was another question from Pauline. Oh, no, sorry, Pamela. Pamela, did you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I have a question. Like, school has some computer for ADA people, but the website is available for everyone, even though no disability or disability. But that's only some student, because they have disability. They need they want that's one station, just like what you mentioned before. There's a room with showing the movies, of showing all those. So all this, is it still conflict with, it does not meet with the EEAAP and cause the ADA not compliant?
So if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, you're talking about like computer lab type of setting or publicly available computers where you have a certain number of computers that have assistive technology and thing installed on it.
Yes.
Right. So that's really more related to providing access. In the context of EEAPs, it's really most often, users will have their own devices that have their own assistive technology installed on them. And then based upon that, using their system technology, does it work for them? Is it accessible for them? Whatever it is that they're trying to access. And the accessibility barriers are ones that it doesn't work for them, right? Those barriers do not work, cause the technology to not work with their assistive technology, if that makes sense.
Mhm. So the content was there. It's only like some people that have disability, they have something, they have some device already is loaded with the disability software or availability, so they can use. So it's not our content. It's not accessible to the disability users, correct?
Well, in both examples, whether they have their own device or whether they're using a computer lab or a publicly available computers and that have the the assistive technology installed, in both cases, it really wouldn't matter from where they're trying to access it from. What we're talking about here are technologies that are inaccessible to them either way. Right? It wouldn't work whether they're in that computer lab and using the assistive technology like their screen reader. It also wouldn't work if they had their own laptop that had a screen reader installed, because the underlying technology, such as a third-party website or an application, it wasn't coded correctly, right? So it doesn't work with the software that they use to get access.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
We have the last two questions, one from Pamela and then also from Rob Salinas. Pam, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, and I'll just read what I wrote real quick in the interest of saving time. I asked, is an EEAAP a requirement, specifically the communication piece? I had a debate with a colleague regarding an alternative assignment for students where he was concerned that just any student might use the alternate when he preferred everybody who could use the inaccessible program to do so. So the alternate assignment could be a way to avoid using a standard tool in the field that he otherwise wanted students to learn. So what would be the legal response to that?
So I would say that that's not, my answer is not prescriptive that you always have to do it a certain way. I think that you need to respect the faculty's approach to teaching, and whether, because basically the alternate means of access is not, it's their choice is what I would say, whether they make that available to just anyone that wanted to take the alternate means, right? Or whether that's for people that are affected by accessibility barriers. And that's a lot of times in the context of instruction, it might be that they need to in, say, the communication plan, say, if you require an alternate means of access, please contact, Professor Jones. And then they would provide anyone that contacts them the specific way of accessing it via the alternate means of access, if that makes sense. So it's not just anyone. Does that make sense? Where they're,
Yes.
I think it's, I would say it's up, I mean, my faculties, or sorry, my colleagues might have slightly different answers, but I think it's up to the faculty to make that determination of what's appropriate for that discipline and things like the essential requirements of the course.
Got it. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
And Robert Salinas.
Hey, Tom. I
Yes,
had
sir.
a quick question.
Sure.
While our campus would have like an EEAP in place, like what would be your best advice for working with the vendor for like an existing long-term solution that will include like a promissory agreement to address those accessibility issues?
Right, that's a great question, and I'll use it to segue to a slightly different topic in that EEAPs are meant to be temporary, right? So the whole topic of EEAP is in the larger context of what are your accessible procurement or acquisition processes for a college? Because there's I should have had this on my slides, but for accessible procurement, there's three main goals or things you're trying to achieve. One is identify specific barriers. Two is, and this is part of what you asked, is work collaborating with your vendors to improve the accessibility of their products over time so that it becomes less necessary to even have an alternate access plan. And if you're collaborating with your vendors and, they're, however you do it to determine the accessibility levels, providing that information to the vendor and hopefully requiring your vendors to complete, which you're familiar with, Robert, an accessibility roadmap included in the contract, right? When something's being purchased, to say, this vendor, we agree to remediate these barriers within this timeline. And it's a contractual requirement, which is kind of how you get vendors, from where they are to a more accessible solution over time. Did that address your question, Robert?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks, great question.
And like there was a comment from Jason, I think this was regarding the answer that you gave to Pauline. He said, would a Bluetooth sound field in all classrooms be an example? I think we were talking about the computers and ADA.
Say that again,
Jason, did you want to kind of clarify?
Yeah, excuse me. So yeah, my question would be, so like, instead of having like one classroom with a sound field where somebody with deaf or hard of hearing, maybe like a earpiece, they want to connect with the sound field in the classroom. It would one classroom qualify for that, or would that have to be all classrooms in order to be qualifying for the EEAAP?
So it sounds like you're talking about a way of providing support for people that are hard of hearing within a classroom environment. Is that right?
Yeah, like so a Bluetooth sound field where their hearing aid will connect to. And so
Right.
they wouldn't have to come to the office, ask for accommodation. They would just be able to walk into the classroom.
Right. I mean, to me, I mean, that's something that you would want to do. And I mean, you folks in disability services that are on the call would probably have a better answer, but typically you wouldn't adjust specific rooms or what have you for an individual, right? It would be more of from a college perspective of, we want to upgrade X number of rooms to support this, to make it more accessible for hard of hearing individuals throughout the college, right? And not specifically tied to, say, a particular purchase or acquisition, if that makes sense. The EAP plan itself is typically more tied to when you're looking to buy something or you're looking to adopt something. And the other, to me, is kind of more of a facility and kind of a college question about making your facilities more inclusive and more supportive of the different assistive technologies, say, people that are hard of hearing would benefit from. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, so that'd be like purchasing equipment for the classroom that would have that capability.
Right, to just generally better support, right? And typically the way I've seen it is that, the facilities group would say, okay, once someone tells them that this is something that would be good for the university or the college to have is, okay, we're going to upgrade these number of classrooms to all support this.
So that would fall under something other than the EEAP.
I think that's what I'm suggesting is that wouldn't necessarily be part of the EAP process per se, but more of a college, ensuring that your facilities are as accessible as possible, like in advance, right? In advance of a user that might have a need for, supporting their device or what have you.
So not so much a assistive technology plan, but maybe a ADA transition plan or something to that effect.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the way I'm thinking. I'm sure there's probably many of you on the call that might disagree with my assessment of that, but to me, that's kind of where it better fits.
I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for your presentation. It was really good. I hope everyone has gotten more information about EAPs. I know it's kind of a thing that's really been in a rise in DSPS and our colleges. So thank you, Tom, for really breaking that down for us. All right, so we are going to take a